An instinctive, sudden, cold sweat lurched Darley to a stop. The blade was at least 5 feet long, and it pointed at his heart. The calm look on the knight's face, his sturdy stance. Something told Darley he wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. Darley turned and fled. "Now you run, you goddamned coward," the knight called. Darley's legs screamed. He was on the very edge of breaking them. The wheat whipped by, stinging his skin and getting in his eyes. He heard hoofbeats behind him. Then tight fingers tied around his arm. He glanced down to see a wild-haired girl with animal eyes. Her broken legs snapped back into place. "Kin," his instincts said. She bit him. Blood drained. Cold shocked up his arm. He screamed and tried to push her away. Unable to dislodge her and unable to bring himself to hurt her, he tore his own arm off. Blood sloshed sluggishly from the ragged stump. He stumbled and dove into the dark woods. Nora greedily drained the arm. It turned to ash. She looked up and pursued. Carl thundered past her, snatching her up with one arm. "Watch my back!" Taryn came in close, but the woods thickened, and they were forced to dismount. She could smell the blood on Darley's clothes, but she couldn't from his wound. Had he regenerated his arm? Shadows grew heavy as the trees grew thick. Carl and Taryn strode forward with their lantern, but she could see the trees and the branches far beyond the light. "I can smell him," she whispered, and started to lead the way. Taryn held the lantern and a club, leaving Carl both his hands for his war sword. They moved quickly. The only sounds: the crunch of dry leaves and small twigs, the scuff of boots on bark, and their own shallow breath. The scent of blood grew weaker. She quickened her pace. "Rats!" Taryn cursed as he stumbled. Nora turned to him. A shadow lunged, and she shouted, "Taryn!" Her toes slammed into a root as she tried to throw herself forward. Her face met dirt. A horrid, blood-curdling cry was loosed. Nora panicked and looked up in a heart-rending fear. Darley stumbled back. Thick blood leaked slowly through his fingers that clutched his face. Carl advanced, but Darley leapt back with enough force to break his own legs. The one-armed vampire disappeared into the shadows. Nora hauled herself to her feet. Her clothing was tight, and she was having difficulty breathing. She tugged on a lace on her bodice, and the whole thing ripped. She looked angrily down. That was strange. Those weren't there yesterday, were they? Taryn leapt up, holding his club forward and the lantern behind his head. The dim light barely went out 15 feet, with trees and shadows lurking beyond. "Back to the village," whispered Carl.
"But I could still track him."
"Darley will want to recover, and he'll need ludicrous amounts of blood. He could easily run for hours in these blasted woods. We would be doomed to be lost. Then he could go back to the village and get what he needs."
"I could still follow him. I'd be safe. He doesn't hurt ladies."
Carl considered this. "You may. Be careful." Taryn started. "Shut it, Taryn." Carl lightly slapped the back of Taryn's head. "We all have to take risks. Not just you or I." Taryn frowned as Carl dragged him away. Nora hurtled through the woods. Each leap was made with enough force to break her legs. She noticed that she could force them to heal faster with her will. The pain was nothing to the hunger, nothing to the guilt. The smell of blood grew, then shrank. She kept tripping, not over unseen branches or roots, but over the ones she could see. It was like she lived in a body not her own. It seemed to her that every passing day made her clumsier. So after several long hours, she gave up. Her fear of the sun rising grew to something greater than her hunger. But at the very least, she knew where Darley was going. Darley slipped from the hay. He shook himself and stalked forward. Instincts he hadn't had when he was a human silenced his feet as he moved swiftly through the dark barn. Cows snorted nervously, and pigs snored. He didn't smell the animals. He smelled the blood of men. The man had cut himself with a knife, and the scent brought him, like the hungry animal he was, to his prey. The door creaked ominously into the small two-roomed home. Children gasped as he suddenly thundered forward. He ignored them. He tore through the next door, dodged around the cradle, and grasped the man. He hauled upward, and ever forward. He broke through the shuttered window, shattering the man's body as Darley threw him to the ground with his one remaining hand. He hefted the man again and fled with his prize as a chorus of screams rose behind him. A strange instinct took him. He tore the man's arm off. He focused. After several agonizing minutes, he flexed. Then, grinning wickedly, he drained the man of blood. A rustling in the wheat? An animal? A man? His head whipped towards it. Then he fled. The horses thundered and followed Nora's pointing hand. The wheat was just tall enough for her to pick up the scent of blood from horseback. They pushed the horses.
"There, I can see him,"
cried Nora.
"at the edge of the woods."
They raced towards the shadow. Carl swept out his blade, and the vampire barely ducked as the horse thundered past. Terran slammed his quarterstaff down, striking the man to the floor of the forest. He then reared his horse. Nora leapt from the horse, landing roughly, but far closer to the prone vampire than Terran or Carl. The vampire threw himself up on two arms and hurled a stone. It cracked on her shoulder, flipping her about. The shattered collarbone was no problem. The displacement was devastating. The man had vanished again into the shadows. A second stone slammed a tree near Carl's head. The knight flinched and slipped behind the tree. "Bastard's getting smart," he cursed. Nora darted after Darley. She could have smelled him, but in this case, she chased the place he had thrown from instead. Terran dove behind a boulder just as another stone sailed through the place his head had just been. The branch slammed into Nora's head. Her skull cracked. Her brain pounded against her cranium, and she was launched back. Her mind was shrouded in darkness. Darley stole around the trees, keeping up his pace. The crunch of leaves marked his every step, and each crunch curled his toes, but he had to keep ahead of that thing that pretended to be a little girl. It had to be a monster. What human would ever break her own legs to chase a man? Still in the shadows, he rounded on the tree that the knight was hiding behind. The lantern rested on a branch. "What?" he thought, as his vision rotated in the air. His mind blurred. Confusion. His origin of sight fell and fell. There was a thump. His head landed heavily on the ground. The knight had hidden in the shadows and decapitated Darley as he stopped to wonder where the knight had gone. Darley could feel his blood that pulled from his heart to reach for his head. But the man stood on his limp body with one boot and his head with the other. "Darren, get your sister over here, and be quick about it," the knight called to his squire. Darley panicked. His panic brought the sensation of his head being slightly pulled. He tugged on that feeling. His head moved, just enough to slip out from under the knight's boot. The man violently cursed and brought his blade down, but without proper footwork, it slammed into the vampire's right lung. Darley gasped and gagged. He coughed blood and tried to rise. The knight kicked him, wrenching his blade free in the same motion. Darley threw himself away and into a tree. He scrambled with his hands and feet together. The blade licked through a leg, and he fell to the ground. The knight was brutal as he severed limb after limb. Darley only barely able to attach the last to be severed before the next was left falling to the ground. All his will and effort was focused on barely maintaining his regeneration through the pain. A cold shock ran up his side. He watched from his severed head as a girl bit his side and drained his blood. The regeneration slowed, then stopped. The will of Darley's blood failed. His head lay on the ground as his body turned to ash. His head followed shortly after. The sight was seared forever in his mind. Nora sat with a slight thump, a satisfied, almost whimsical look on her face.
I hope we don't get stuck with too many of these. Chasing him around was a real pain.
I hope they're all like this, said Taryn. Makes it so much safer to hunt them. I agree with the girl. That woman's husband would be alive if Darley was one of the cocky types, replied Carl. Taryn looked instantly regretful. That's not what I meant. I know, said the knight. He took a cage from his horse and pulled a small parchment from a pocket. He squatted down, and he scratched down a quick letter, then let the falcon from the cage fly. He then drew out a water skin and drank. He handed the water skin to Taryn. Taryn took a large gulp and coughed. That's not water, he gasped. Better not be, said Carl. I would be very disappointed if the ale I bought in Winterwort had been water. Carl took the skin and swallowed another drink. Best ale in the Empire. I don't want to know what bad ale is like, Taryn said.
Can I try?
Asked Nora. You bet your bloody face you can. She paled.
There's blood on my face?
She tried desperately to wipe it off, only to stop when Taryn burst into laughter so violent that he coughed again. She glared at him and took a swig. I think I like it. They rode back to the village about the Lord's manor and castle, Hawkroost. They expected the journey to take 2 to 3 days. During the second night, Nora shifted uncomfortably in the saddle in front of Taryn. What's wrong? He asked.
It's,
She glanced nervously at Carl. Taryn slowed the horse. She sighed, blushed, and whispered.
I'm having difficulty breathing.
That's awful. Do you need to see an apothecary? A priest?
No.
She tugged on her bodice. It ripped. Scowling, she said,
It's these things' fault.
Huh, Taryn said after glancing down. Were those always there?
No, they sure as hell weren't there when Madeline resized my clothes.
Language, snapped Taryn.
Sorry,
she muttered.
Am I taller than I was last week?
I'm not sure. Can I ask Carl? She is taller. A few fingers at least.
What's happening to me?
I haven't the faintest clue. But that does explain how absurdly clumsy you are. He hesitated. I think we need a second opinion. We're going to Winterwort to see a witch. Tears loomed over the man and woman. The fear was putrid in the air. It smelled like piss. Their eyes watered with it. Their hearts thundered to its beat. They were useless. So were their children. The woman was comely and full of softness, which was a polite way to say she was fat. Top it all off, he had made one of his best entrances, full of menace and cold passion. He didn't want to eat them. The thought made his stomach curl. Eating cowards always did. He didn't even want to kill them anymore. But he had to. He always had to. He had a reputation to uphold. A thump landed on the furs on his back. His eyes glanced aside to see a still quavering pitchfork. Then he turned to the door. The room was a bloody mess. Flames licked up the tablecloth from a toppled candle. A pair of small corpses were splattered across the walls. Those blows had been some of his best work. The consistency of the bone, the way the remains hung on the walls. There was a girl framed in the doorway by moonlight. The look in her eyes. Hate, fear, bravery. Ah, yes. This is what he was looking for. A man pushed past her. I said get out of here, and leave it to me, Laura, he said as he leapt forward, axe in hand. His eyes held naught but hate and worry. Tears grinned and laughed in ecstasy. Which one would survive this?